It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, and his name is Drew Pack, and he's a senior policy analyst with the Institute of Politics at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, Drew is here. He has a wealth of experience in community and economic development. And I know if you're here, you are all about your community and its well-being. If whether you're running for office, like we have several candidates here, or whether you're a business person, or an educator, or a retired person working at a nonprofit, or an executive director at a nonprofit, I know you all care deeply about your community. So that's why it's exciting to have Drew here. He has worked for the Federal Reserve Bank at the St. Louis branch and the Cleveland, Pittsburgh branch. And what you'll find out, what you'll learn is that these are vital institutions to our economic growth in our towns and our rural areas. And Drew has extensive experience focusing on economic challenges and the opportunities for investment in our region. His work has involved collaboration with community members, nonprofits, education leaders, and elected and private public officials across Western Pennsylvania. He's really passionate about this topic, as you will hear. So you might think this is a big city guy, but he's not. He's really a small town guy. And he's a native of Birmingham, Alabama, but he grew up in the Pittsburgh region, and he graduated from Pathworth High School. And he attended community college of Allegheny County, and et cetera, et cetera. And he's got a great education, and he comes to us from the University of Mississippi with his bachelor's in political science and a master's in professional community and economic development. So I'm really proud that Drew and moved that he would come up here to Indiana, Pennsylvania, and be with us today to talk about community and economic development and all the things that, as you see from the title, how we can fuel our communities with. We got human resources, and now we need the financial resources. So he's going to talk a little bit about that and many other things. So I'm going to turn it over to Drew. And Drew, if you want to use this right here, that's that. And
Okay.
All right, let's have a round of applause for Drew Pack.
Thanks, Commissioner Hess, for that introduction. And oh, sorry, they tell me to shelf. You guys have all these fancy TVs around. I'm still with a 3-ring binder, doing. But I've learned working across different areas that you never know when broadband will go down. So I still use the binder. And yeah, like as Commissioner Hess said, I've had the opportunity to work, different areas of the country. Grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, moved to Pittsburgh. My dad actually worked for a steel company that was based out of Pittsburgh. I always say too, me and my brother, we had the opportunity when we got in trouble over the 2 weeks they closed the plant down to clean the steel plant. So we didn't get to work in it, but we had the opportunity to clean it. So that was a pretty dirty job. And he always had a reason to, tell us, you guys need to go do this. And then my granddad actually in Alabama was a coal miner and a coal mine inspector in Alabama. So Birmingham and Pittsburgh actually do have a lot in common in the regions as far as like steel and iron and coke production and coal. But I'm here today as a senior policy analyst at the University of Pittsburgh. I have started the job in January, so it's been fantastic to get to know Board of Fellow members like Commissioner Hess. She does so much with the various work that we do at the Institute of Politics. So I really appreciate her asking for me to be here today. And a lot of what I'll talk about with finance, I'm really trying to strike a balance between people with no financial background, and some of you guys are probably pros in this and can probably tell me a lot more about how you create municipal bonds for water and sewer and those type of things. So I'm trying to kind of strike that balance. Also a balance between practical and theoretical. So think about different ways that maybe these frameworks don't necessarily apply to the job that you do, but maybe would apply for other things that you guys do. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll start off by talking a little bit about the Institute of Politics. So the Institute of Politics basically has three different divisions that makes up it. The first is the Thornburg Forum, which this was named after the Attorney General Thornburg, who's here from Pennsylvania, Dick Thornburg. And really what they do is a lot of lectures and bring in speakers from all over the country, really talking about civility, governance, things of that nature. So that's a great thing to be a part of. And then one thing that we do is a lot of student engagement. One of those is the L.C. Hillman Civic Forum. Tasha Peacock is the person that runs that for us. And we place people with different community members, elected officials. So you guys might have opportunity to, and I'm sure some of the students have worked with you guys before. Any good internship opportunities, let us know. We're happy to place students. And then you have us at the Policy Institute. So we work on nonpartisan way on policy issues. Me personally, I focus on community and economic development in our fiscal and policy and governance. And since I joined in January, I'm still trying to figure all of this out. Still recruiting some committee members also. So I look forward to continuing to work with you guys, especially here in Indiana County. And as Shireen said, before coming to Pitt, I worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland in the Pittsburgh branch. And when I worked in the Pittsburgh branch, we covered all Western Pennsylvania and Northern West Virginia. And we also had peer, because there's 12 Federal Reserve banks that really worked across large regions. So in the Pittsburgh branch, really working across Appalachia, the area also lined up with like the Richmond Fed, with Virginia, working down through Maryland. So we would work across, these different areas too on a lot of regional different projects. But today, here's a little bit of idea of where we're heading and where we're going and what I want to talk to you guys about. And I think one of the biggest things that maybe is difficult sometimes to better understand is really finance is still about relationships, especially in communities. It really is relationship driven. So that is so important and so critical. And I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about making those relationships, making those partnerships in a little bit. And then one thing I'll talk about is the diversity of your types of capital and then different ways to stack capital. So this is basically trying to create more efficient ways, more funding sources for you guys to have more opportunity. And when I talked to Commissioner Hess about doing this and speaking to you guys, I really wanted to focus more on the bottom-up economic development, local economic development. How can you guys drive economic development? There's a lot of things that go on outside that we only have so much control over, but these are some opportunities that you guys can really implement locally and create that reinvestment in Indiana County. The third thing I'll talk about is the different financial institutions. So I'll talk a little bit about the Community Reinvestment Act. I'll also talk about community development financial institutions, community foundations also, which I know you guys have some of these good partnerships in Indiana County, have a lot of good institutions. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And the next part is really being prepared for investment opportunities. So we talk a lot about, I think the watershed was a good example because we talked about having a playbook, kind of going off the same model, knowing what that plan is so different municipalities can understand what each other are doing, which creates collaboration and creates more efficient ways of working together and more efficient funding streams. So I think that was actually a good example. And then next is really what to consider when talking to funders. I always get a lot of questions from people about, well, what should I ask the bank, or how much money is too much money? What do I need to include? So I'll get into that a little bit. And the last piece will be sustaining local capital and really working across smaller areas, rural areas. It's very vital because there is a lot of leadership change to make sure that you have the supports in place to continue the capital, even if you have a leadership change. in various areas. And please feel free to stop me and ask any question too. I'm happy to answer it. I'm happy to talk back and forth on some of these topics. But the first thing is really, when is the right time to ask for funding? And I tell people often, make the relationship before you ask for money. None of us like having somebody come to us we don't know and ask us for money, much less people we do know. So create that trust before. And this could just be sitting down and having coffee with a banker or, you know, a funder, potentially like a foundation. And so start cultivating that relationship early and continue to maintain that relationship. And then I would also say, like, be strategic with your investments when you're telling your story. I know for some areas, and we'll get into this a little bit more, you know, being strategic about which funder you want to fund which project is often really critical and important, especially because they fund different things. So knowing that, understanding where they're coming from, where you're coming from, what your priorities are is also really important in creating that relationship that works for you guys. The second part is talking to funders. So I would say one thing is funders do talk to funders, something I've learned. And we've actually created in some areas funders networks. So I work a lot with Appalachian Funders Network that covers all of Appalachia. And bringing together the funders, it really helps to have them better understand from each other what's going on in various communities. So they do talk about, you know, what nonprofits are doing good work, what other entities are in the area, what, you know, does that municipality have the ability to absorb this capital and put it to work? So it is important to have those funders speak to each other and understand what's going on in the community. And they definitely do talk. I also often at the Federal Reserve would get these questions of, you know, tell me what's going on in Indiana County and who's doing good work in housing. You know, we potentially are interested in investing in Indiana County. You would get those type of questions. And then I think also when you're talking to different funders, like, again, multiple funders is very important. You know, you guys talked a lot about conservation too. So it's like, again, who funds conservation and how do you catalyze other funders to fit that? And some of these could be conservation and housing beside each other, just a park, you know, with conservation, those things that kind of combine funding and funding resources. And I would always say collaboration is very helpful and is very key, but we all know it's easier said than done. But again, as collaborative as you can be, the more funding sources you will have. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's also important. You guys have any questions yet? All right, just let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm going to start giving you guys a little bit more examples of some things that could help. So basically, I would say there's three types of capital kind of really focused on the community level, which would be public, private, and philanthropic capital. And public capital does a lot of things. Again, with you guys talked about stormwater, wastewater, all these important infrastructure projects. You know, there's different programs through the USDA, SBA, all those larger scale programs that are very important. Usually bring grant dollars, you know, to our communities to fund community economic development. There probably is less public-private partnerships in the United States than there are in some other places. The UK tends to do a lot more public-private investment. And I think when I work with smaller places, a lot of this is hesitancy. It's I don't understand or want to take the risk to put public and private capital together. You know, I don't feel comfortable being the fiduciary, those type of things. But I'll tell you, with the right partners, with the right leaders, you can kind of break down some of those barriers and create public and private partnerships that do work in multiple ways that really do pay off. And then philanthropy it really plays a strong role. It's very much played such a strong role, we know, in Western Pennsylvania, in the history of philanthropy in Western Pennsylvania. And it's good to get those foundation dollars because they're often really flexible and you can kind of navigate those towards a lot of the needs in your community that, maybe the grant funding is very specific for a certain project, and the addition of philanthropic dollars helps to engage other parts of the project. So think of maybe like a childcare center that's important for workforce that gets a workforce grant, for the childcare center. And then maybe you want to increase teacher stipends. So philanthropy would be a good way to help kind of bridge those gaps and to help encourage childcare in your region. So there's opportunities like that working kind of across this, and stacking capital is what I really talk about. So putting different layers, if you think about it, public, private, and philanthropic capital as various layers, and then leveraging them when you need them at certain times. We all know that there's so much change that goes on in our communities, and we still want the work to be done. And maybe you don't get all the funding at that time, but maybe there's an opportunity to bridge some of that with the other dollars that you do have. And the biggest thing I would say is you want to reduce roadblocks, in funding. And again, the more types of funding you have, the various sources of funding that you have will really help mitigate some of those roadblocks and get you through some of those difficult times. A lot of my work too has been working with small businesses. So again, we saw COVID, we saw PPP loans, some of the partnerships with that. Not all small businesses actually work with banks necessarily. Some of the local nonprofits were actually the ones to lend out the money to small businesses for PPP loans. Or a lot of businesses too needed kind of that startup capital to get back going once, we kind of were through the pandemic. So, that those various sources of capital are helpful. And I would say too, aligning different capitals helps kind of go from piecemealing projects to having a more collaborative and comprehensive strategy, because you're putting those different capital partners in the mix, putting those visions together. So again, a lot of it is about policy and vision, but also the capital too that goes along with it to help bring out that collaboration among your funders and your investment in your community. And hopefully by doing that and layering capital, you're able to sustain funding. You're also able to take that dollar and recirculate it in your community, to create a higher economic impact, $5, $10 of economic impact from that $1. And I told you guys I would talk about community foundations, and I think you've seen like a new kind of community foundation. I'll also say right now we're going through the biggest wealth transfer in history right now. So a lot of people do want to leave money for their communities and mark that money. So community foundations have worked a lot with different families on, creating that next generation of investment in communities. And right now, with generations turning over, some of that capital can be captured and stay in your local community working through community foundations. And the example I have up here for you guys, I like this example because I think it's one of the easiest examples of what you can do. And this was started about 10 years ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. So Charlottesville, technically still under the 50,000 threshold to be considered rural, the city itself. And what the bank did and the philanthropic organization is they both put up $50,000 to make a $100,000 revolving loan fund for small businesses. And over time, as you see kind of with the data, this has helped create 173 new businesses. So you got to think about this over time, how this adds up, jobs created, investment dollars too. And so the Charlottesville Collaborative Loan Fund, I think, has been a very good example of, simple, let's come together with philanthropy, come together, as a bank and to be able to continue to fund different businesses. And I know as the economic developers, you often have businesses come to you with different needs, different issues that they're going through. They may have, a great idea, but they don't have good credit, kind of thing. Or they may need a bridge loan. They might have a big, order coming up, but they need the bridge loan to actually purchase the product or equipment to do the work that's coming up. And another thing too, I would say is, some of the community foundations are good at like appropriating funds, working with funds. They have kind of that financial expertise. So a lot of times I tell, local organizations to make those relationships, find out who it is that can kind of help you through some of the financing to better help you. So you don't have to spend all your time running the accounting side of things. And I'll talk to you guys a little bit later about Erie and some of the things that they've done with their community foundation, which I think some of you guys know about, but have been really helpful in revitalizing Erie. And the next thing is a great tool. I don't know if a lot of you guys have heard about it, but it's the Community Reinvestment Act. So the Community Reinvestment Act was created basically because of redlining and instituted in the 1970s. So banks are taking loans from a community. They also need to be reinvesting those loans back into the community that they are have physical branches in. And they do this through their community reinvestment officers. So if you look up a bank, look up their community reinvestment officer. Like I said, make that relationship, maybe make it before making the ask for funding. But banks play a critical role in our communities. They're often leaders, they're on a lot of our boards. So I really don't like, they're not necessarily that distant institution. Sometimes they really can be working with you guys on community development. So there's three parts of it that they actually get tested on, and they have to have satisfactory or better, or they can't merge with another bank, or they can't acquire other banks. So that's kind of the carrot and stick in this. And all the evaluations of lending for every bank you can be found on the FFIEC.gov website, the Federal Reserve's website, Office of the Comptroller of Currency, or the FDIC's website. So any of those, you can go look it up for a local bank. And the interesting part is when you look in the public evaluation, we talked about housing. So you can see some areas where maybe they haven't done as many housing loans. So maybe your organization works in that area. You can go talk to them about, hey, I saw that you're doing less lending for home ownership in this area. How are some ways that we can partner? So that data in the public evaluations is very important. So some of this is done through lending, which are loans. One thing I would talk about is like workforce development being an example. So you might have a school, but they need a loan for equipment for a new program that they're going to do for workforce development. I know some of the career and technical education centers that have those partnerships with local banks when instituting new programs. And hopefully what will happen too is the bank will give like the school a lot lower interest rate. So, that's very important right now. Interest rates are still very high. So that's one of the ways that lending works, or it could be, lending for, a business incubator, the building, the revitalization, rehab of that. And then the next thing is investments. So investments can be grant dollars. So some banks do have foundations that do grant out money for multiple purposes. So you have those type of investments. But also, as I go back and talk about Charlottesville and their small business fund, that was actually an investment into the organization. So they're able to, the loan fund's able to pay back those dollars and recycle those dollars. So you have investment actually in the organizations themselves. And I'll talk about community development financial institutions in a bit, which will definitely give you guys a little bit more insight into bank investment in some of the larger investments that they make in community development institutions. And then the last part is services, and some of this goes back to relationships. So bankers get services from like sitting on board. They have to be using their banking background to be on board. So that's also why they're treasurers, things of that nature on your boards and help do that. And I also think it's important too, because if you don't have a banker on your board, and you're trying to attract capital, it's great to have them on your board so they know what's going on, so they can, know better what you're doing in your organization and the different components of it, to go back to the bank and to help with different, type of projects. I know too, some nonprofits are having issues right now with making payroll because of some of the issues, going on federally at the budget. So you'll often see two nonprofits work with banks to, just make those payroll loans. And again, like hopefully less interest rate than what a normal like prime business borrower would get. So banks can be a powerful mix of capital for small businesses and community reinvestment dollars. But I would say they do tend to need clear and investable projects. So like the more clarity, the better when you are talking to them. Bankers always say they don't necessarily know always what's going on in City Hall. So it's very good to like talk to them to better understand kind of what's going on in the community. And another thing too, I'll bring up about the Community Reinvestment Act is it's based on census tracts. So you can also look up by census tract, which is a low and which is a moderate income census tract. There's also community reinvestment opportunity in moderate census tracts, say after like a FEMA designated disaster, actually. It's also very important too to have some of those partnerships because when we do have natural disasters, we go back to being a cash society. So doing that, getting the small businesses back up and running is also really critical to small businesses. In my work with the Appalachian Funders Network, I mean, we still are talking about North Carolina and Helene and the impact on that. And just all the opportunities that have come from it that are new, but all the things that we're trying, at that time that were just emergencies, and the funding that needed to be there at that time for the community to operate. And I could go and speak like a whole day on the Community Reinvestment Act, not going to do that. I'll say too, like it does sound kind of complicated, but just kind of know what it is, kind of know some of the attributes of it. I still say the onus is on the bank to talk to you about it, to say like, this is an LMI area, this is an LMI area, this would count, this wouldn't count, but make those partnerships. And again, it's kind of up to them to really understand, the pro forma sheet and knowing how the finances pencil out. So just make that partnership, know what it is. You don't have to know every detail about the law. That can take years and years and years to learn. So don't bog down in that, make the relationship. And one of the next things I'll talk about, which I really love, I mean, honestly, community development financial institutions are just such an interesting part of, I would say, community development. And they've really grown and become larger and larger and larger. In fact, I was reading an article yesterday in Stanford's Innovation Review that talked about our CDFI is too big and talking about how, maybe there needs to be a different balance in communities because some of the CDFIs have gotten extremely big in the country. They were started in the 1990s, if you guys remember, under the Clinton administration. And as I said, I worked for the St. Louis Fed and I was in Little Rock, Arkansas for part of that time. And Little Rock had the second CDFI in the country called Southern Bancorp. So Southern Bancorp is actually a bank that's a CDFI. So it's interesting because it's a bank with like a social and community development mission. And again, the people that they're extending loans to, working through, not just saying no, like let's work through this. Let's help build your credit. Let's help get your business the technical assistance, so we're more comfortable making this loan. They also had a foundation side, so they could put the loan money with foundation capital to merge together to help the entrepreneur. Some things that they do too are like credit repair, which is very important. Also, we'll kind of warn you if you got to pay for credit repair, that could be a bad sign. We work with a lot of different organizations that, Department of Treasury, Pennsylvania, things of that nature, CDFIs that can help and usually do that for free. And I use this picture to kind of help you understand the type of investors into CDFIs and then the type of programs that they work on. So it could be even a corporation that makes an investment in CDFIs. You saw Netflix actually make some large investments in CDFI in the wake of George Floyd. So even Netflix is like invested in CDFIs. A lot of it too is community foundations and organizations that help do that to get more dollars, to people that need them. And then banks are big investors in CDFIs, as I discussed with you guys. So a lot of time banks can't take the risk. So what CDFIs do is help take some of that risk off the bank and put it more into a portfolio or loans that can be a little bit more risky. And also what CDFIs can do is go after grants from like the USDA, the SBA, some of the housing authorities too, so they can mix grant money with other type of funds, to really help out local communities, homeowner, I wrote on there, small business, home ownership, nonprofit help. So they do a variety of different things, and there's about 1,500 in the United States. I'll say every CDFI is not necessarily created the same. So some of them may do only consumer lending, some may only do small business lending, some may only do like commercial projects where it's like new market tax credits, revamping these large buildings. So know kind of who they are and what type of projects they're forming. Some of them do it all kind of thing, down to even consumer loans, emergency loans also for like vulnerable populations that maybe that $500, helps bridge them during like a payday time. So they'll often have those type of loan funds too available. And I would say too, like CDFIs work really well in rural areas. If you look at the data and you look at the lending patterns, rural areas, and you guys were talking about water, so a lot of times they will do the loans for water and sewer also through USDA lending, things of that nature. But they're a really good partner. And for Pennsylvania, there's about 30 in Pennsylvania across the Commonwealth. So this is from the CDFI Coalition for Pennsylvania and their report from last year. So you see only about 23% of the loans went to Western Pennsylvania. So I think there's a great opportunity here to continue to grow this, continue to make those partnerships with CDFIs, maybe even create some new CDFIs that can help, increase the lending across Western Pennsylvania. And I will tell you too, in the 2024 report, CDFIs in Pennsylvania in total loaned out $194 million. And on their books in 2024 in Pennsylvania, they had $500 million in outstanding loans. So again, that's a lot of money focused directly on communities, directly on community development and economic development for our local communities. And the last thing I want to talk to you guys about, I think a lot of us know some of what's been going on in Erie. I was lucky when I moved back to Pennsylvania. It was about 6 years ago. So Erie was one of those places I really wanted to get to, and they were going through all their revitalization. And it was really the Erie Community Foundation that had put up the money to like really jumpstart Erie into their revitalization. And then Erie Insurance too, we all know that that's also part of the Community Foundation, so a good corporate partnership that was able to come together. And then the city too, having certain funds, they actually have 3 small business loan funds the city of Erie does to work with under-resourced entrepreneurs in the city of Erie. So I think they're a pretty good example of stacking capital, kind of bringing it all together. This is an example of their prospectus. So you can actually go out online and go to Infinite Erie, who's an organization that's kind of keeping up with the prospectus. And you can see different projects that they're prioritizing across the city, which is about 30 from 2024 to 2025. The Bay Market House is one of those examples. So you can see kind of like where they're at with funding, how much money they still need, the economic impact that each project would have. So I think it's important, even if you're a small place, that you know and you have kind of the priority of these are the 5 projects we're working on. You know, this is what the economic impact would be. So having that prospectus and having that shared vision is very important. Right now, they're actually taking projects for 2026. So again, they're kind of bringing them together, evaluating them as like a multifaceted, different organizations across the community, all the way from buildings to social services, also small business services too, included in that. So I do think it's an example of, you know, something that's really gone well, and Erie has really put themselves on the map with reinvestment. I know the Brookings Institution was very helpful to them too, so that helps, you know, getting that type of partnership. So, but I know like Bruce Katz was there, he was speaking, and he said every community could hire 5 people on investing in capital, attracting capital, and stacking capital, and that still wouldn't be enough. So, you know, it's very difficult sometimes to do, easier said than done, but it's very important. And last, I'll talk about sustaining sources of capital because it's very critical. You know, you know, grants often get us off the ground, they get us going. They put the initial investment in so we can work on various projects. But sustaining that capital is often very difficult. And I use the puzzle picture because honestly, you're always going to be putting together these pieces of the puzzle. You're always going to be trying to make the right fit when it comes to different projects and capital and putting them together to work effectively. So I use that kind of as a picture for this. But it's not just about the capital. It's not just about raising funds. As I said, it's about maintaining those relationships and cultivating those relationships and getting that help and understanding each other and building that trust to really bring capital into your community and to sustain it. And, you know, important to sustaining that would be leveraging multiple funding sources, blending and stacking the capital effectively to kind of understand how best to prioritize different things for funding across your community. Obviously, that long-term vision we know is important, that shared vision. And I would say too, like, you know, working with public and private capital, it's a little bit of a culture shift for a lot of organizations. But again, like there are partners that are very good at helping to do this. There are ways to do this to make sure, I think, you know, local communities have more ownership over their capital and what they want to see, and they know their needs better than somebody else would coming in to have that local economic development and be able to invest that capital back the way your community sees is best. And one of the other things I would say too, in maintaining sources of capital would be it also spreads the risk. So when you have multiple organizations, it spreads kind of the capital risk. So I go back to the key takeaways that I started with you guys. And the first thing is relationships and partnerships. So this is really the soil from everything that grows, is those relationships. And then diversifying the capital, which helps kind of create a more multifaceted financial ecosystem in your community. The third part is the institutions that are critical for those investments. And preparation and readiness. Again, I could ask you today, what if you had $1 million for your community? What would you do with that? What if you had $5 million, $10 million? That's actually a harder question to answer because again, like what are our priorities? What would we put up first? Well, how much capital does this get or that project get? So again, being prepared. And then, like I said, sustaining that local capital, you know, whether it's like sustaining leadership that helps sustain the capital or bringing in various organizations that can help kind of bring that capital together. And even if there is a change in the organization, you're able to kind of help bridge some of those gaps for that amount of time to keep lending going and to keep what you want to do in your community economic development, turning in your community. But thanks for having me here speaking in Indiana County, and I'm happy to open up the floor to any ideas or thoughts or questions you guys might have. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah, Bill, here.
I think one of the points you made is money attracts money.
Yep.
I'm sure you've heard of the $10+ billion AI facility that's supposed to come in. And there's a bunch of other ones coming in nearby and throughout Western Pennsylvania. Hatfield's been mentioned a couple of times. Two questions. Are these companies or entities, are they coming to help support the communities that they are building this stuff in? And where are they getting their money from?
That's a good question. So we've had a lot of discussion about this, and we haven't put out like a policy paper or anything yet. But what I tell communities is be prepared. Get the most that you can up front, because they are coming. I will say, there is some economic impact. There are some workforce impacts, but the workforces also tend to be transient, right? They're here one day, gone tomorrow. And I really do think a lot more needs to be done on the local level to really understand, like, what is the impact to the community? What are the things that the community can do to make community agreements up front to make sure that money's diverted to other issues in the community, right? It could be like, again, like affordable housing, right? So making an investment there by the company. And I do know some of the counties have gotten money up front for like their economic development or their community foundation. So I really do, at least in my, not just because Commissioner Hess is standing right there, but kind of leave it the local government right now to kind of figure that out. But I would at the IOP like to study this more and have more of a plan for communities, because it's happening quick, and to better prepare our communities to get the most they can out of it. And as far as our money, it's, venture capitalists, private equity, all, from who knows where.
Yeah, you mentioned FEMA,
Yes.
and I was wondering how the new FEMA being kind of passed to the states now, this responsibility. How's that impacting this whole funding stream? Because I'm actually working on a project that we were going for federal funding with FEMA, we exhibited with them, but now it's like, what do we do? I mean, we're planning to just go to the states individually. Is that kind of just FEMA existence? I don't know.
You're asking questions way above my pay grade. I will say, I mean, I had a friend that worked for FEMA, and he would go in and like he would be a spokesman for the local area. He would work with small businesses. His family owns like radio stations, and he would do this kind of like on his own time. And again, I can't say it's important enough, like to go in and like have the SBA work with small businesses, during disasters. And like I said, the Appalachian Funders Network, seriously, like from the Helene example, has a lot of good lessons learned about what to do and what's helpful. I'll also say too, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland did a study on the Kentucky floods a long time ago, and then the Kentucky floods kind of have started again. So I would look at those resources. But yeah, I would say the more you can help out people in your communities and be able to divert the money when there is a disaster, having like that community foundation is very helpful when FEMA maybe isn't there. Yeah.
Does still exist.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't know. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Could you give us some reasons or circumstances where these capital funding organizations would be turned off by certain groups that are requesting funding. What would disqualify a nonprofit? Some of the leading characteristics of a nonprofit that would turn off, almost guarantee that they would be refused or turned down for any requests.
Yeah, so I mean, talked a lot about trust. So like I said, funders talk to funders and they will ask about nonprofits in your community, you know, the executive leader, the executive leadership team, different projects that they've worked on in the past. So, you know, if there were financial issues that they couldn't work through, leadership issues they couldn't work through. Honestly, if the community municipality couldn't get it together, right? You know, we tried, didn't really work out, don't really want to go back to that community. Some of those would probably disqualify and, you know, and make it more difficult to get funding.
Well, there's that feeling all too prevalent. There's a tension between nonprofits, profit-making organizations, and you know, it's like fighting the hand that feeds you complex that would discourage generosity on the case. I mean, part of profit-making organizations.
Yeah, and I would say too, like again, making those relationships is important and critical with funders and nonprofits. And that's one thing I've seen is like the foundations will trust like what the bank says, right? So if the bank's like, hey, I've worked with this, you know, organization, this nonprofit, you know, I think they're a good investment, you know, like that kind of like conversation that kind of helps drive that. So yeah, you kind of never know who you're talking to or what organization. But it's just important to make those relationships and do your due diligence.
Yeah, I think what I take away from that is the importance of being prepared and leadership and building relationships. And you must do all of those things all at once, all the time. It's like that movie. So we're gonna take one more question because we really do need to get moving on. And I think Drew will stay around a little bit to talk with folks afterwards.
It's so cold, I might go get a Christmas tree already, so.
So you can talk about the importance of, you know, maintaining those like healthy relationships and that community trust. Can you give me examples of different like communication tactics or programs that you've seen any of these institutions develop to attract small businesses, especially newer small businesses, to those conversations?
So I helped build like a business incubator in Florida when I was first starting out. So I got to do a lot of that. And I would say like, so Regions like gave us furniture and all this stuff. And I was like thinking they were just nice, but really it was the Community Reinvestment Act of why Regions was giving us those investments. But yeah, I think with small businesses, you have such different types of ownership. So it's really interesting when you have just various issues and the immigrant community too, like 3 times more likely to be entrepreneurs, maybe don't have the bank credit background that some of the other businesses do. So that flexible funding is really important. Also do think that Pennsylvania, you know, kind of upping their Main Street, you know, network and putting in some of that funding across the state will be very helpful to that also. But yeah, different small businesses and the CDFIs, like I said, too, are the technical providers. So like a lot of times when I'm talking to small businesses in the Small Business Development Center here too, like I always tell them, go to the Small Business Development Center first, you know, get all that situated, then go ask, you know, to the funder. But yeah, there's so many different small business owners and meeting all their needs is very tricky, but that's where, again, having those multiple partners that focus on different parts of like the entrepreneurship and small business ecosystem is critical.
Question. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we're going to wrap it up. Very nice, Drew. Let's have a round of applause for Drew Patton.